As mentioned, I'm Ari Melber. I am in for Lawrence O'Donnell tonight. As we turn to the news, the big headline here is that Donald Trump did cave in to pressure today. He bowed to critics and he ousted his EPA chief, Scott Pruitt. This story matters for many reasons, but among them is the fact that it shows reporting, pressure, and accountability still can work in Donald Trump's Washington. And it may not be a coincidence that Donald Trump put this news out today, which is, of course, a traditionally sleepy period after July 4th. If Donald Trump has to cave, maybe he wants to do it during a holiday news week when he thinks fewer people may not notice. But that's just the optics part. The substance is far more important. And the substance tonight that I can report to you is Scott Pruitt's out. Donald Trump tweeting it today. And then he told reporters that while everyone knows the controversies with Scott, within the agency, he said, we were extremely happy. That is largely false. Pruitt was under fire precisely because people within the EPA blew the whistle on his conduct. Reports ranging from making an aide find a job for Pruitt's wife to spending $40,000 in taxpayer money on a soundproof phone booth to trying to get a discount on a used Trump hotel mattress to the bizarre errand he asked his security detail to run, buying up scented lotion from the Ritz Hotel for him. That's just some of the scandals. All told, there were 15 investigations of his actions. One of them already found that he had broken the law. This was the ultimate in swampy behavior. Donald Trump ignored that in his speech tonight, telling supporters he's changing Washington and draining the swamp.
Washington tried to change us, but instead we are actually changing Washington. We've had a big impact. We need Matt Rosendale in the Senate to continue our fight to drain the swamp. We're going to get it done.
Now, Pruitt's swamp habits may have been particularly brazen and tone deaf, but he's not alone. Trump's Commerce Secretary recently exposed for pocketing as much as $6 million with improper divestment delays. His Interior Secretary under pressure for dealings with the oil giant Halliburton. Trump's Treasury Secretary exposed for questionable taxpayer-funded travel, an issue that cost Trump's Health Secretary his job already. And then, of course, there's Trump's housing chief, former presidential candidate Ben Carson. He's actually probably the closest to Pruitt in allegations of petty fleecing, like spending $31,000 to redecorate his own office. You take it all together, this is a portrait of greed and self-dealing, and it's worth remembering exactly who it is that's acting this way. The Trump cabinet is the wealthiest in American history. Millionaires and billionaires who argued they would better prioritize the public interest because they're already rich, and they'd have less temptation to fleece the government. That's an argument, but it hasn't worked out that way. In fact, we are witnessing the exact opposite, a cabinet of entitled one-percenters who appear so out of touch, sometimes they don't even realize they're risking their jobs when they do these things. Now, this kind of greed is often likened to pigging out, which is, of course, why greedy spending on behalf of your own district or your own interests is called pork barrel spending. Scott Pruitt and Tom Price, though, they went beyond even the usual Washington pigging out. In terms of their careers, they stuffed themselves to death, like suicidal geese trying to foie gras themselves. And even if Donald Trump won't concede Pruitt's errors in his speech tonight, he did surrender through his actions. Trump is so obsessed with spin that even if he takes a corrective action for whatever reason, like ousting Pruitt, he then refuses to preach what he practiced. And while one embattled official leaves this administration tonight, I guess the laws of Trumpism kick in to reassert some kind of balance in the force, because here's the other thing you need to know. A possibly more controversial figure is joining this team, former Fox News co-president Bill Shine. He will become Deputy Chief of Staff for Communications. Shine was part of Roger Ailes' leadership team, accused in several lawsuits of failing to address harassment at the channel. And former Fox News anchor Megyn Kelly, now an NBC anchor, had publicly said Shine failed to act on credible claims against O'Reilly that she brought to him. Shine joins the White House after heavy lobbying from the man reportedly known as Trump's shadow chief of staff, Fox host Sean Hannity.
ex-Fox News boss Bill Shine in talks to become White House communications director. If that's true, I think it would be great because he's great at his job. And he's one of the smartest people I've ever known and one of the nicest people I've ever known. As far as what I know about it, it's if I did know anything, it's none of your business anyway.
None of your business. I am joined by Eugene Robinson, Pulitzer Prize winning writer for the Washington Post, as well as an MSNBC analyst, Jennifer Rubin, a conservative opinion writer at the Washington Post and an MSNBC analyst as well, and David K. Johnston, a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist who founded DCReport.org and the author of It's Even Worse Than You Think: What the Trump Administration is Doing to America. Jennifer, on the staffing, what does it mean to you that Pruitt was finally ousted and Bill Shine is on his way in?
Well, let's start with Bill Shine. If he's the nicest guy that Sean Hannity knows, I'd like to take a poll of the women at Fox. This in the middle of the Me Too movement, which he mocked, by the way, in his rally today, is the sort of infuriating behavior that has women fleeing the Republican Party. And you see that ever-widening gender gap. As far as Scott Pruitt goes, I think part of the motivation here was to get him out of the way before the big Supreme Court rollout on Monday, because who wants Scott Pruitt hanging around? There's also now allegations of improperly, illegally altering government documents, so that's out there. But let's be honest, Trump didn't get rid of him for months and months, and Congress, the Republican Congress, didn't exercise proper oversight authority, didn't subpoena documents, asked nicely for some documents, asked in some letters, but they didn't do their job anyway. The biggest crook in this entire administration is, of course, at the top, Donald Trump. The fish rots from the head. That's the guy who has the major conflicts of interest, the foreign emoluments, the hiring of relatives with conflicts of interest, and an entire attitude towards government that this is all about him. It's all about making him even richer.
Making him richer. And David, on the Pruitt side and the cabinet, it's not a crazy possibility that somebody who was both independently wealthy and public service minded could serve. FDR, the Kennedys, there are examples. But it's really not turning out that way. Do you think that at some point there's a critical mass where enough Pruitts happen and people think, gosh, maybe Trump's not putting in the best people?
Well, I don't know. Donald's numbers have been very, very consistent with people who believe he is their savior. But Pruitt was a clownish and cloddish predator who Donald used as one of those he stocked the swamp with rather than draining it. He's being replaced, at least on an interim basis, by an actual lobbyist for Murray Energy, the coal company that worked hand in glove with Scott Pruitt and Donald Trump. And with Bill Shine coming in, you now have a man who not only facilitated, as Jennifer points out, all the sexual harassment that went on at Fox News, but who is a very polished guy and who will know how to make things look smoother and will get out of the way people like Pruitt and put in place much more clever, much more slithering creatures in the swamp that Donald Trump is building up.
Well, and that, of course, raises the question, how do you get smoother than Scott Pruitt, given his use of lotion, Eugene?
It's true, and he probably exfoliated too as well. But look, Scott Pruitt became a joke. I mean, what do you have to do to get fired in this town? It was scandal after scandal after scandal after scandal, and in a way, that's the story, that he survived for so long with so much of this baggage, so much that was just clearly not just improper but beyond the pale. But I think David is right. I think Trump is actually trading up in terms of professionalism, in terms of ability to get stuff done without creating controversy that you don't need. And so I presume Andrew Wheeler at EPA will continue the policies that Scott Pruitt started, only he'll do it more cleverly and more professionally and more quietly, and just keep changing those regulations.
Well, and in terms of shining a light on that, Jennifer, reading some of the reporting here on Mr. Wheeler, who's a new name because he's coming into Pruitt's job today, former coal lobbyist who shares Pruitt's zeal to undo environmental regulations. But unlike Pruitt, he's viewed as mentioned here tonight, a consummate Washington insider who avoids the limelight, has navigated the rules. Wheeler's friends and critics alike say he could prove to be more effective than his controversial former boss in implementing Trump's deregulatory agenda. And I wonder whether this is sort of the Mike Pence piece of the administration. There's all of the controversial and sometimes, frankly, embarrassing conduct around the more flamboyant members of the Trump administration. But then beneath that, there is a hard right group of people moving much more quietly. And if so, what, if anything, should be done about that, Jennifer?
Well, I think you're right that, in essence, this is trading up. Although Scott Pruitt had a great reputation, he actually wasn't that effective. A lot of his efforts at deregulation got tangled up in the courts, and he really certainly set the ball in motion, but he didn't get all that far on several major initiatives, including his scheme to get rid of car mileage standards. So we'll see whether the new insider is a little bit more slick, a little bit more clever. But to be honest, none of this is going to change until Congress changes, because what we're missing right now is a co-equal branch of government that's willing to exercise oversight. That's entirely absent right now. And so long as Trump and his cronies are in power, and so long as the Republicans are giving him a free pass, nothing's really going to change.
Well, but I wonder, and let me play, Eugene, some of the pushback we've seen, because the usual calculus in Washington is you can wait out any story and eventually things will move on. In the Trump era, things move very quickly. The Pruitt story seems to be different in the pressure because there was a reporting piece of all this information. There was a whistleblower piece, so Trump's own people speaking out. Then there was a public piece. I mean, this has got to be one of the more well-known and more disliked EPA chiefs in any party in a long time. Here was this moment that sort of captured a lot of civic imagination of someone confronting Pruitt in person. Take a look.
Hi. I just wanted to urge you to resign because of what you're doing to the environment in our country. This is my son. He loves animals. He loves clean air. We deserve to have somebody at the EPA who actually does protect our environment, somebody who believes in climate change and takes it seriously for the benefit of all of us, including our children. So I would urge you to resign before your scandals push you out.
Gene, this is a harder question, but where does that sort of activism fit into keeping things on the front burner, on the agenda in a way that actually matters? Because certainly not every civic debate we're having right now can end with wait for the next election, whenever that may be.
No, I mean, look, as you said, things move so fast these days and under this administration, that it is probably true that you can kind of survive any one bad story, depending on how bad it is. But Scott Pruitt could not survive 37 bad stories. He could not survive the accretion of impropriety after outrage after insanity that he ran through. I mean, it just was not possible. And he was becoming a drag, a political drag, potentially on Republicans looking ahead to the midterm elections. I mean, why would Republican senators, Republican House members want to go out and have to defend Scott Pruitt's pursuit of Ritz-Carlton lotion and a used mattress from the Trump hotel? I mean, why would they have to defend that? They wouldn't want to.
Fair. I mean, I don't think anyone wants to even talk about it, let alone defend it. And yet here we are. And I take responsibility for anchoring the conversation. David, there are a lot of things that Donald Trump does that really don't get the criticism they would if any other president did it. I'm going to play for you Donald Trump tonight. I mean, this is not the lead story, but here we are a week after this terrible shooting in a newspaper. Here we are talking about information we only know because journalists have reported it out. And this is what the President of the United States is saying about the free press tonight. Take a look.
Fake news, bad people. They say a source within the administration. They make the sources up. They don't exist in many cases. Anytime you say, I saw one of them said 15 anonymous sources. I don't have 15 people in the White House. I mean, forget it. 15 anonymous sources have said all sorts of stuff. These are really bad people.
David, how do you view this, and how do you view confronting it in the context of something that people talk about all over the nation, which is normalizing this stuff? People say, well, it's not surprising. Well, it may or may not be surprising, but it's certainly problematic in a free democracy. Go ahead, David.
It's going to be really important in journalism that we point out that things that were reported using anonymous sources play out to be real. But, you know, you started this episode a segment talking about the pressure on Trump that led to Pruitt's resignation. What Donald Trump cannot survive is the disclosure of his tax returns, and in particular if he's criminally indicted about them. So at DC Report today, we have a follow-up to my New York Times op-ed on Donald Trump's tax returns and how to get criminal authority to the New York State Attorney General to go after him, because she's made it clear she believes he's committed tax crimes. It will not happen unless pressure is brought on a Democrat, Andrew Cuomo, who would like to be president, and unless he gets a firm message, you will authorize an investigation of Trump's tax returns. Donald will keep sailing along, and, you know, he might get 2 terms, but he cannot survive disclosure of his tax returns or a state indictment.
Spoken by a reporter who has come closer to parts of the tax returns than just about anyone else. So an interesting point for us to reflect on. David, Gene, and Jennifer, thank you very much.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.